Vivid verses.
My sister asked for 6 weeks. I gave her the guest room and the smaller bathroom and didn't think about it again until the truck arrived with more than 6 weeks worth of things. Her house had water damage behind a wall, a slow leak, the kind that rots joists before anyone notices the smell. Her husband, Dennis, called it catastrophic on the phone, though when I saw the contractor's estimate later it ran to 4 figures, not the number that word implies. 2 kids, a dog, a renovation with no fixed end date. I have 4 bedrooms and live alone. The math was obvious, and I've never been someone who makes people ask twice. Just till the contractor's done, she said. Might be a month. Might be 6 weeks if they hit anything else. I said, of course. I meant it. I still believe, looking back, that I meant it honestly without any of the reluctance I'd have been within my rights to feel. My sister and I have never been close in the performative way. We don't call weekly, we don't do a holiday tradition with a name, but there's a baseline loyalty between us that doesn't require maintenance. When she asked, I said yes the way you'd hand someone a tool they needed, without ceremony. The first 2 weeks looked exactly like what had been described. Her older kid took the guest room. The younger one had an air mattress in what I still thought of then as my study. Dennis apologized for the inflatable mattress every morning, as if its presence were a moral failing he was working to correct. I told him it was fine. It was fine. What I noticed and didn't mention was the pump. The little electric pump they used to inflate and deflate the mattress each day, plugged into the outlet behind my desk, run at 7 in the morning while I was trying to have coffee before work. I noticed it the way I noticed most things, clocked, filed, not commented on. A week later, the pump was still there, but the mattress wasn't being deflated anymore. It stayed up. A dresser appeared beside it. Not theirs, a spare one of mine that had been in the basement, now upstairs, now full of a 7-year-old's clothes. I want to be precise about how this happened, because precision is the only fair way to tell it. There is no single day I can point to and say, this is when the study stopped being mine. It eroded the way most things erode, through a sequence of small requests, each reasonable on its own, that only look like a pattern in aggregate. Do you mind if we leave the mattress up? Saves us the hassle every morning. Would it be okay if his dresser stayed in there for now? Our place doesn't have room with everything packed. He's been sleeping better in there than in with his sister. Do you mind if we just call it his room for now? Each question had an obvious answer, and I gave it. What was I going to say? No. Deflate the mattress, put the dresser back in the garage, make an 8-year-old sleep worse, so I can reclaim a desk I use for evenings a week. I have never been a man who fights the small fights. I fight the ones that matter, and I fight them once completely at a time of my choosing. That's not a policy I invented for this. It's simply how I'm built. But I noted it. I want to be clear about that too. Noting is not the same as accepting. I began without deciding to keeping a private ledger. Not written down, just tracked, the way you track anything you intend to use later. By the second month, the study was gone in every sense but the deed. My desk had migrated to a corner of my bedroom, wedged between the dresser and the window, because there was nowhere else for it to go. I did my evening work there now, badly, on a laptop balanced on my knees half the time, because the desk didn't fit against that wall properly. I told myself this was temporary. I told myself it a lot that year. Mornings changed shape entirely. I've had the same routine since I bought the house. Up at 6, coffee, 20 minutes with the news before anyone else in the world is awake enough to need anything from me. That 20 minutes had been, for years, the only part of the day that belonged to no one but me. Now the kitchen was populated before I got downstairs. My niece did homework at the table she wasn't doing the night before, some crisis about a project due that morning, and the dog, who I had not agreed to, but who had arrived anyway, wanted out, wanted in, wanted out again, on a schedule dictated by a bladder I had no say over. I stopped having the 20 minutes. I noticed exactly when a Tuesday for months in, when I came downstairs and there was no space at the table and no path to the coffee maker that didn't require conversation. And I stood in the doorway for a second calculating whether it was worth saying something and decided again that it wasn't. Not yet. Not for this. That's the part I'd ask anyone to understand if they were inclined to judge the silence. It was never that I didn't notice. It was that I was deciding continuously what was worth spending on. You don't spend your capital on a coffee maker. You spend it on something that will actually move the outcome. By month 5, the arrangement had fully inverted itself. I was the guest in scheduling terms, if not in ownership. Dinner happened at a time set by my sister's family, not mine. The television was on a schedule of cartoons and homework shows I had no opinion about and no say in. My name was still the one on the mortgage, the insurance, the deed, every document that mattered, but the daily texture of the house had become theirs, and mine was the schedule that flexed around it. There's a specific moment I still turn over because it tells you everything about how they'd come to read the situation. My sister was in what used to be my study, now apparently the kids' room, in casual conversation, an appellation nobody had asked me to ratify, going through a box of the kids' old toys, deciding what to keep and what to give away. I stood in the doorway. It had been, not long before, a room with my books in it, a leather chair, north light. I'd chosen the desk position specifically to catch. "We should probably talk about pain in here," she said, not looking up. "The blue's a little much for a kid's room. Maybe something neutral." I didn't say anything for a second, and she must have read the pause as consideration rather than what it actually was, because she kept going, already 3 sentences into a plan. "I was thinking we could do it over a weekend. Dennis's brother has a sprayer. It'd go fast." I said, "Let's hold off on paint." For words. I remember them exactly because they were the closest I came in that entire year to objecting to anything directly, and even then it was phrased as a scheduling note, not a boundary. "Sure, no rush," she said, and put it down, and I understood, with the kind of clarity that comes rarely and should always be trusted when it does, that she'd heard not yet and not ever. She thought I was managing logistics. She had no idea I was managing her. This is the part that's hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. The silence wasn't submission. It was reconnaissance. Every time I let something pass, the pump, the dresser, the paint conversation, the 100 small territorial claims that accumulate when a family moves into a house that isn't theirs, I was gathering information about how far they intended to go and about how completely they had convinced themselves the arrangement was permanent or at least indefinite, which amounts to the same thing when you're the one paying the mortgage on indefinite. Dennis was worse than my sister in this regard, though I don't think either of them would have described it that way or even recognized it in themselves. He started referring to the garage as his workshop, began keeping his tools out there in a way that implied tenure. A pegboard he'd put up without asking. My car pushed to the driveway, permanently, because his truck had claimed the space near the door. He asked me once, over dinner, what I thought about eventually finishing the basement, since we're all here anyway. We're all here anyway. Present tense with no expiration built into it. I said I'd think about it. I had already thought about it, extensively, and the answer had nothing to do with the basement. What none of them understood, and I include my niece and nephew in this, though they're blameless in ways their parents aren't, was that every unchallenged claim was being logged, dated, and weighed. Comfort, to them, read as consent. It wasn't. Comfort was the theater I performed while the actual decision-making happened somewhere they couldn't see it. There was one dinner, maybe month 6, where my sister actually said it out loud. The thing I think she'd been feeling but not articulating, which was relief bordering on assumption. "I don't know what we'd have done without you," she said. "Honestly, I think we've kind of forgotten how to live any other way." She meant it as gratitude. I heard it as a timeline. A woman who has forgotten how to live any other way is not a woman planning to move out in 6 weeks or 6 months or on any schedule she hasn't been given a hard reason to keep. I said, glad it's working out, and passed the potatoes and went upstairs afterward and sat at the desk wedged into the corner of my bedroom and thought, with the same flat clarity I bring to any problem that has an answer, about how this was going to end. Because it was going to end. I want to be honest about the fact that I'd known that for months before I did anything about it, that the delay wasn't indecision, it was sequencing. You don't dismantle an arrangement like this in anger, in the middle of a fight about paint or dogs or dinner schedules, because anger gives the other side something to push back against. You dismantle it the way you dismantle anything structural, quietly, with the load already redistributed before anyone notices the wall coming down. The contractor call was the first move, and it was almost embarrassingly simple. I called my sister's contractor directly, not through her, which she never found out about until much later, if she found out all, and asked as a favor, framed entirely as concern for her and Dennis's sake, whether there was anything I could do to help the renovation move faster. Money for a second crew. A word to the supplier if the tile was backordered. I wasn't subtle about wanting it done. I was subtle about why. The contractor, a man who clearly appreciated someone speaking his language of deadlines and change orders instead of vague hopefulness, told me the truth. The job could have been finished 2 months earlier if my sister and Dennis had made faster decisions about fixtures and hadn't paused twice to reconsider budget. It was, in other words, dragging because there was no urgency on their end. There was no urgency on their end because there was nowhere they needed to be. I understood this immediately as both diagnosis and instruction. I paid for the second crew myself. I told the contractor it was a surprise, that I didn't want my sister to know where the acceleration had come from. And he didn't ask why, because contractors rarely question a client who's handing the money to go faster instead of slower. Within 3 weeks, the timeline that had been maybe 2 more months became 5 weeks, then 4. The second move was the lawyer, and this is the part I'd ask anyone to consider carefully before judging as cold, because it wasn't cold, it was correct. I didn't know, walking in, what my actual legal footing was. Family living in your home without a lease occupies a strange middle ground. Not quite guests, not quite tenants, and the law in most places doesn't care how the arrangement felt informally. It cares how long they've been there, whether they've established what's called residency, whether removing them requires the same notice you'd give an actual tenant. I sat in an office that smelled like carpet cleaner and told a woman in her 50s, over the space of 40 minutes, the entire situation, factually without editorializing, the way I describe a contract dispute rather than a family crisis. She asked how long they'd been there. I told her. She asked whether they paid anything toward the household, utilities, groceries, rent in any form. They hadn't, not once, not even an offer that I'd declined. That detail mattered more than I expected. It meant, in the eyes of the law in that jurisdiction, that they were closer to guests than tenants, which gave me more room than I'd assumed I had. But she was clear that more room wasn't no room, that depending on how long they'd been there, courtesy notice of 30 days, in writing, was the safest path regardless of the technical minimum, because it removed any ambiguity if things went badly. I asked her to draft it, not to send, not yet, but to have ready, worded plainly, dated for whenever I decided to use it. She asked, at the end, almost as an aside, how I was doing with all this. I told her I was doing fine. She looked at me for a second in a way that suggested she didn't quite believe the flatness of my answer, and then let it go, because that wasn't what she was being paid to assess. The third move was the movers, and this was the piece that made the whole plan irreversible in my own mind, because once I'd booked a date, the date existed independent of my mood on any given day. I called 3 companies, got quotes, picked the one with the earliest availability that also had good reviews for speed. I wasn't interested in gentleness, I was interested in throughput, and booked a full crew for a Friday, 6 weeks out. I paid the deposit myself. I gave them my sister's address as the destination, the renovated house, on the assumption, which turned out to be correct, that would be finished by then. 6 weeks. That was the number I settled on, and I chose it deliberately, long enough that the contractor would have the house genuinely ready, so there'd be no argument about being put out with nowhere to go, short enough that I wasn't giving them room to renegotiate the premise. 30 days was the legal minimum according to the lawyer. I gave them more than that, not out of softness, but out of strategy. A longer runway meant no one could later claim I'd acted unreasonably, and it gave me time to make sure every piece was actually in place before I said a word. Throughout those 6 weeks, nothing in the house changed on the surface. I still passed the potatoes at dinner. I still said, glad it's working out, when the subject came up, which it did, periodically, with the same tone of settled permanence that had been building since month 5. Dennis mentioned the basement again. I said I'd think about it, and meant this time that I'd think about it exactly as long as it took me to finish the thought and move on. The hardest part, if I'm honest, wasn't the logistics. It was maintaining the same face at dinner every night while a countdown ran underneath it that only I could see. I don't think that's dishonesty, exactly. I think it's discipline. I wasn't lying to them about anything they'd asked me directly. I was simply not volunteering information before its time, which is a different thing, and one I've never had trouble distinguishing. My niece, in that stretch, started calling my study, the room, the dresser, the mattress that had long since been replaced by an actual bed I hadn't been asked about, my room without qualification. Not the room I'm staying in. My room. I heard her say to a friend on the phone once, describing where she'd hung a poster, and I remember standing in the hallway and feeling something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but sat close to both. She was 8. None of this was her doing, but it told me, with more clarity than anything her parents had said, exactly how settled the whole household had become in an assumption that was never actually true. 3 weeks out, I confirmed the mover date. 2 weeks out, the contractor confirmed the renovation would be done with several days to spare. 1 week out, I picked up the signed notice from the lawyer's office, 30 days language built in even though I was giving closer to 6 weeks in practice, and put in the drawer of the desk that still didn't fit properly against the wall of my bedroom. I didn't feel triumphant reading it. I felt something more like relief, the specific relief of watching a plan that's been running silently underground finally surface intact. I told them on a Saturday morning, because Saturdays meant everyone would be home and there'd be no excuse of work or school to delay the conversation into fragments across a week. I made coffee at 6 the way I used to, in a kitchen that was for one more day still not fully mine. I waited until 8, until my sister and Dennis were both up and the kids were occupied with cartoons in the next room, and I asked them to sit down at the table. My sister must have read something in my face because she asked, half joking, "This isn't a family meeting, is it?" And I said, "It is actually," and watched the joke die on her mouth. I kept it short. I'd rehearsed it, not for eloquence, but for economy. I wanted no ambiguity, no room for the conversation to be reframed as a negotiation, because it wasn't one. The renovation, I told them, was finished. I confirmed it with the contractor myself 2 days earlier. Movers were booked for that afternoon, for a clock, a full crew, everything arranged. They'd be sleeping in their own house that night. For a second, neither of them said anything, which I'd expected. The gap between hearing something and understanding it takes a moment. Even for adults, especially when what they're hearing contradicts an assumption they'd stopped even recognizing as an assumption. "Wait," Dennis said. "Today? You're saying today?" "This afternoon," I said. "The house is ready." I checked. My sister's face did something complicated, surprise first, and then, almost immediately, hurt, the kind that curdles fast into accusation when someone feels blindsided. You checked? You've been. How long have you known the house was done? A few days, I said, which was true, though it understated the months of engineering that preceded those few days, and I saw no reason to volunteer the rest. The point wasn't to relitigate the last year. The point was the next 8 hours. You could have told us. We could have planned. Christ, I haven't even packed most of the kids' things. They're not going to have clothes for school Monday. You'll have all afternoon, I said. The movers are efficient. I picked them for that specifically. This feels, she stopped, recalibrated, tried a different angle, the kind of pivot I'd anticipated because I know my sister and I know what guilt sounds like when it's reaching for leverage. You know, we've been going through a lot. This past year hasn't been easy for us either, moving twice essentially the stress on the kids. I know, I said. That's part of why I made sure the timing lined up with the renovation actually being finished. You're not being put out anywhere. You're going home. This is our home, she said, and I let that sit for exactly as long as it deserved, which was not very long, because we both knew it wasn't true, and saying it out loud like that only confirmed how far the assumption had traveled from the original 6 weeks. It's my house, I said, not sharply. I want to be clear that my voice didn't rise at any point in this conversation. I promised myself that going in because raising my voice would have handed them something to react to instead of something to absorb. It always has been. You needed somewhere to stay while yours was unlivable. It's livable now. Dennis tried next, a different tactic, practical objection instead of emotional appeal. We can't just pack a whole house in an afternoon. That's not reasonable. You've had 6 months to accumulate what's here, I said. The movers are professionals. Most of it's boxes and furniture, not decisions. I'm not asking you to make choices today. I'm asking you to let them do their job. And if we're not ready by 4, you will be, I said. I've scheduled the day around it. I'll help however's useful. I'm not disappearing. I'm just not extending the date. There was a stretch, maybe 10 minutes, where my sister cycled through the stages I'd expected, almost in order. Shock, then hurt, then a plea framed as concern for the kids, then something closer to anger when the plea didn't move me. You've been planning this, she said, and it wasn't a question. This isn't sudden for you at all, is it? You've had this ready for weeks. Yes, I said. I watched that land harder than anything else I'd said, because it confirmed what she must have half suspected the moment I said this afternoon, with that much certainty in my voice, that the calm wasn't spontaneous generosity toward good timing. It was the execution of something that had been under construction for a long time, invisible to her the entire way through, while she'd been telling herself and me and everyone at that dinner table that we'd kind of forgotten how to live any other way. Why didn't you say something, she said quieter now, some of the fight going out of it. Any time in the last 6 months. Why didn't you just tell us it was too much? This is the question I'd actually thought about the most in all those months of silence. And the answer I gave her was the true one, stripped down to its essential shape. Because saying something wouldn't have changed the trajectory. It would have started an argument about degree, a little more time, a little more space, a little more patience. And we'd have had that argument every few weeks instead of once. I decided it was more useful to fix the actual problem than to manage the feelings around it as they came up. She didn't have an answer to that, not right away. Dennis looked like he wanted to push back on the phrase, manage the feelings, but seemed to sense correctly that it wasn't a hill worth dying on at 8 in the morning with a moving truck 4 hours out. The rest of the day ran the way I designed it to run, efficiently, with very little room for the conversation to reopen. My niece cried briefly, not because she understood the politics of the day, but because an 8-year-old doesn't distinguish between a room and a home. And to her, they were the same thing, and I felt that loss on her behalf more than I let myself feel anything on my own. I told her the new house had a bigger yard, which was true, and that she could paint her new room any color she wanted, which was also true, and which was, I noticed even as I said it, the exact offer that had never been extended in my house, because my house was never actually going to become anyone's blue bedroom. By 7 that evening, the last box was in the truck, the dog's leash was coiled in Dennis's hand, and my sister stood in what had briefly been her kid's room, and was again my study. Empty now except for a bed frame the movers were dismantling, and looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not hatred, something more like recalibration, the look of someone updating a model of another person that had been wrong for a long time. "I don't think I really knew you," she said. "You knew me fine," I said. "You just assumed silence meant something it didn't." She left without hugging me, which was, I think, the first honest thing to pass between us in months. The house, that first night, was quiet in a way I'd forgotten a house could be. No pump, no dog at the door, no dishes in a sink at an hour that wasn't mine. I walked through the empty rooms once, not out of sentiment, but out of the same instinct that makes you check a lock twice. Verification, not celebration. The study took 2 weekends to restore properly. I moved the desk back to its place under the north-facing window myself, refusing the offer of help from a neighbor because there was something I needed to do with my own hands after a year of doing everything else with paperwork and phone calls and a lawyer's careful language. I repainted the wall my niece's mother had wanted to make neutral, back to the blue it had always been. I put the books back on the shelves in the order they'd been in before, which I still remembered, because I'd never actually stopped noticing where things belonged, even during the months when they weren't there. My sister and I talk now, less than we used to, more carefully than we used to. She hasn't asked to stay with me again, not even in passing, not even as a joke about future renovations. I don't think she will. I don't think she needs to hear an answer to know what it would be. Mornings are mine again. 6 o'clock, coffee, 20 minutes before the day asks anything of me. I sit at the desk sometimes in that window, not working, just sitting, the way you might stand in a room after a long illness has finally left it, checking that everything is exactly where you left it, and finding, mostly, that it is.
Thanks for listening.